Okay, we're going to take a step aside from just coding queries, and we're going to talk about migration. So migrations is not a Prisma thing. It's a database thing, but Prisma makes it easy to work with migrations. So when we've been making changes to our database, right, we would just change our schema file and then run npx prisma db push. This pushes our changes to our database, and this is really good for local development and testing. But in the long run, you want to keep track of all your database changes, and this is where migrations come into play. So let's start off by creating our first migration. So to create a migration, you run npx prisma migrate dev -- name, and then you want to name your migration. I'm going to call it init because this is the initial migration. And it's saying some stuff. We need to reset. Right, so there's no history. There's no history of our migrations or our databases. So it's saying like, hey, like our current knowledge of our database is different from this migration. So we have to, it wants us to reset our database, right? Because we never started migrating, so we never tracked any history. And that's okay here because we're just playing around with data. So just make sure you know what you're doing here. We're going to delete all of our database data because we don't care for it right now. So now we create a folder called migrations inside of Prisma. And in here we have the date and the name of what we called init. And if you look inside here, we have a migration.sql file. And this is the SQL query that's responsible for creating our database tables based on our Prisma schema. So let's say your boss says, okay, we can't use Prisma anymore. We don't like it. So it's okay because you have the SQL data to create the tables again with a different ORM or using raw SQL. And so the concept of separating from Prisma in the future if you have to, or just keeping these migration files is so helpful. And you can also it's good for like learning too. You can see like what is it doing. Create table user ID, integer not null, primary key auto increment, email text not null, and name text. Text doesn't say not null. Why not? Because it could be null because we made it optional. And so now let's create. So now whenever we do changes, we're not going to do db push. We're going to create a new migration. So let's create another migration, but we should create a change in our database for it to make sense, right? So let's create a new field in our post table called views. I want to make it integer, and I want to make it add default 0. Okay, and I'll do npx prisma migrate dev -- name, and I'll give it a name. I'll call it post table. I'll be very explicit so people know what the history is. Post table add views column. There we go. And now the migration is created. Create a new date timestamp, and what's the update? Create table new post, insert into, alter table. So it might be different based on if you're using SQLite or Postgres or MySQL, but here it's creating a new table. It's moving all the data, and then dropping the original table, and it's gonna rename it. So that's the way it's doing it here, instead of. I think it's an SQLite specific change. Important point: migrations are not used with MongoDB. Only SQL databases. With MongoDB, just run db push, because there's no raw queries like in SQL. Cool. So that's migrations, and that's the workflow you want when you are working with Prisma after you're done prototyping.